Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. Of course, it's an important day. It is the inauguration of President Donald Trump. It is freezing cold in Washington, D.C., but we are dealing with that. We both got in today. Niall, Stanage, so good to see you.
Always a delight, Robby. Good to see you too, even in these very cold temperatures.
Yes, we have my radar, your notes, as we are going to take two different sides, attitudes toward what the incoming Trump administration means. But before we get to that, we have big breaking news from President Biden this morning, doing something, his parting shot that we're going to discuss in just a moment. First, we're going to take a look at St. John's. A private mass is taking place. The Bidens and the Trumps are meeting for tea. They will wind up by noon being sworn in. Donald Trump will, as the 47th president of the U.S. Here is footage of Donald Trump arriving at the White House to be greeted by President Biden. Let's look. Okay, and there we have Donald Trump and Melania meeting Joe Biden, Jill Biden, the First Lady, and exchanging pleasantries there in advance of having their little tea gathering.
As those ceremonial pictures go on, there is also news, and it is big news. In what is likely President Joe Biden's parting shot, he announced blanket preemptive pardons for General Mark A. Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the members of the bipartisan House committee that investigated January the 6th, that includes former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, and another pardon for Dr. Anthony Fauci. Not to be outdone, Trump has said he is considering pardoning New York City Mayor Eric Adams in his federal corruption case. Adams is expected to show up in Washington, D.C. today, as he was issued a last-minute invite to the inauguration. Preemptive pardons shield individuals from any prosecution for any crime, and while they have been used before by President Abraham Lincoln after the Civil War, in today's political climate, they could set an interesting and perhaps dangerous precedent. We will talk more about that soon.
But for right now, I want to focus on one of those pardons in particular. Longtime viewers will not be surprised that we're going to concentrate on Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been the subject and wrath of this show, my tenure here for the last 4 years, for how he handled the COVID pandemic. Specifically, whether he supported gain-of-function research that could have led, and perhaps did, to COVID-19. Critics of Dr. Fauci, including myself and Senator Rand Paul, believe he did in fact mislead Congress about gain-of-function research, which they think could have taken place in a lab in Wuhan, China, which was ground zero for the COVID virus. Now, there have long been unanswered questions about whether government-funded scientists were fully transparent about risky virus experiments that did take place in that lab and very near the origins of the viral outbreak of COVID.
Here are Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Fauci going at it in a congressional hearing.
Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function.
So
let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans,
right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about.
And here is some more.
What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab and NIH funded it.
That is
you can't
not...
get away from it. It meets your definition, and you are obfuscating the truth.
I'm not obfuscating the truth.
Senator
You are the
Paul's
one.
Time is expired, but I will allow the witness to...
Let me just finish. I want everyone to understand that if you look at those viruses, and that's judged by qualified virologists and evolutionary biologists, those viruses are molecularly impossible to result in SARS-CoV-2.
Cause the pandemic. We're saying they are gain-of-function viruses because they were animal viruses that became more transmissible in human, and you funded it.
And you
admit the truth.
Then there was this from a Rising interview conducted several years ago with Anthony Fauci.
I want to make one point because you bring it up, is that people talk about the research that was funded by the NIH. If you look at the viruses that was studied there, and we never get the chance to articulate that, usually because people interrupt and already start talking about gain of function, gain of function. If you look at the viruses that was studied and published in the peer review literature, any card-carrying virologist who knows about viral evolution will tell you that it would be molecularly impossible for those viruses that were worked on to be turned into SARS-CoV-2 by accident or by intent. They are evolutionarily so far from SARS-CoV-2 that that would be impossible. Yet, when you talk about research that was funded by the NIH, people make an inappropriate conflation of those experiments with SARS-CoV-2. Now, having said that, do I keep an open mind that, in fact, somewhere beyond anything that the NIH has done with funding competent Chinese scientists, could there have been a lab leak as a possibility? The answer is, of course.
So here we are. When the preemptive pardon for Hunter Biden came out, we discussed that, and I think you said it was not a good thing for the norms of our democratic system, and I think that certainly applies here as well. But beyond just this is unprecedented and this is not good because preemptive pardons for people are not a great way to go out. I am specifically very, very upset about the Fauci pardon for the reasons we just discussed. I am not accusing someone of crimes without having that's got to be adjudicated through a law enforcement criminal justice system. Certainly he deserves due process. I don't know what exactly caused COVID, but there are real, tangible questions. They are not just partisan. There are left-leaning people. My old co-host Ryan Grimm was very troubled by what had gone on at NIH with EcoHealth Alliance, which has now been debarred, I think, from receiving government funding because they did seek to do, in Wuhan, experiments on viruses very much along these lines. We don't know if those experiments ended up taking place. We don't know. But it is perfectly valid to scrutinize whether this research was being conducted, whether it was in unsafe conditions, and whether it was U.S. funded. And Barack Obama, this is not partisan, Barack Obama said, stop doing this research. There were certain exceptions in the law that Dr. Fauci signed off on. He's testified to that point, that he can't recall exactly which ones he signed his signature on and said then go forward, but he did do that. There are plenty of questions. Millions of people died. And maybe this is not the reason, but it is fair to pursue it, and I am outraged that this is being taken off the table.
So the gain of function issue is obviously inherently a complicated one. I do think that there are questions to be answered there. I wouldn't deny that at all. And it was interesting, even looking at the congressional testimony, that Fauci seemed to be defending himself from an argument that Rand Paul wasn't really making. Fauci's argument, I think, was the gain of function experiments could not have created COVID, whereas Rand Paul's argument was we shouldn't have been funding gain of function experiments. Those are two different things. Now, I do think that, I think in broad terms, I have probably a more generous view of Anthony Fauci than you do, in that I think he was trying to grapple with a once-in-a-century pandemic to the best of his abilities, and there are going to be not just sort of mistakes made, but there's going to be new knowledge arrived at that changes your conclusions. So I'm broadly pro rather than anti-Fauci. That does not remove the fact that I think broadly preemptive pardons are dubious. I will get onto the Mark Milley case in a second, which I think is more complicated, but yeah, I don't love preemptive pardons.
Yeah, and if they were, look, if Republicans or Trump or whoever was threatening some criminal matter into Fauci that was focused on guidance he gave during the pandemic that I disagree with and that I don't think was good. And I think that the idea that he kind of as basically admitted to making up, a social distancing, 6 feet of social distancing, his inconsistency on masks throughout, that at first we don't need them, then it's any mask works, just get a mask, then it's, no, actually you really need the highest quality mask if you're going to bother wearing a mask at all. None of that is criminal. None of that is, look, I disagree with him, but you are allowed as an advocate for public health measures to express views that I think are wrong or policies that I think are bad. It's none of that. If that's what they were talking about going after him for, I still don't know that a preemptive pardon would be a good idea, but I would be more sympathetic. It's not about that. It's about the inquiry into the origins of COVID that to me is just so fundamentally important to understand. Even if molecularly, and that is up for debate. There are experts who do think the disease does resemble something that could have been manipulated in a lab. But even if it wasn't, I want more safety, biosafety around these kinds of proceedings. So that's what is bad. But
I think that is a genuine path of inquiry. What I don't like sometimes about the debates around Fauci is it is people with really no scientific knowledge at all taking a Facebook post or some random theory and using that to trump the experience of a man who has decades of work in this area, and I don't love that. That is not to say that it can never be questioned. I just think that some of it is very bad faith argument.
That's fine, but I just can't let the very people who were who profited from this kind of research being funded, I mean, who were in charge of doing the grant, asking for the grants, they all got, at the beginning, they all got together and said, oh yeah, this couldn't have came out of a lab, and that is suspect. That can be looked at. So
let's move on to the Mark Milley thing, because here is one where my concerns about exceptional circumstances trump my resistance to preemptive pardons. The Mark Milley case regards or pertains to a call he made to his Chinese counterparts right after January the 6th, where he was reassuring them that the United States was not going to attack China or something of that nature. Now, Milley says that call was made with the cooperation and knowledge of Mark Esper, who was then the Secretary of Defense. Trump, when this came to light, described the call as an act so egregious that in times gone by, the punishment would have been death. Now, if you have an incoming President of the United States who has previously suggested that somebody would have been put to death for a call that is at worst made in disputable circumstances, then I think that is a much more valid case in which you can, a rare instance in which you can justify preemptive pardons.
I'm so outraged by the Fauci example. I can't even work up any disagreement with you on that. I didn't quite recall the circumstances of I would have to look at it more closely to form an opinion. Obviously, he shouldn't be put to death for any reason. That was a sensational tweet, and I am hoping to see more sober-minded foreign policy from Trump in the future. But Biden saying that running on the idea that Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy and our norms, doing these things on the way out the door. After saying, I've seen a clip on social media of Jake Tapper asking him about preemptive pardons years ago, and Biden saying, absolutely not. Maybe Biden wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't remember saying that, but pretty bad stuff.
I still think the Hunter Biden one is the worst of them all, but I suspect Mr. Fauci trumps that in your mind.
He does indeed. All right, next up on Rising, I have my radar on the mood in the country as Donald Trump is inaugurated, as he racks up 2 important policy wins, and Biden continues to not win. Stick around for that.